Thank you all so much for joining us for the Untangling, Gerrymandering, and Redistricting workshop, which we were hopeful was going to be live on Saturday. But due to the coronavirus, we are here on Zoom recording this conference. Wanted to make sure everyone is okay with the recording. We do ask that if you have questions during the presentation, you use the chat box, and at the very end we will open up the questions to take live questions from the audience members. But if you want to type during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat box. Today you have an amazing panel. Liz Tantarelli, President of the League of Women Voters, Henri Clement from the New Hampshire ACLU, who is doing amazing work on voting rights and redistricting, and we're happy to have a talented lawyer on our team. Kiri Claflin from the Kent Street Coalition, who's been doing amazing grassroots organizing on the redistricting fight for several years now. And we will soon have Lucas Meyer. We see Lucas on the line with Pretty Strategies, who is a lobbyist for America Vote, and myself, Olivia Zink, Executive Director. I'm going to kick it over to Liz Tantarelli to start the presentation today.
Thank you, Olivia. You know, when we talk about redistricting reform, we're talking about stopping the sitting state legislators from drawing voting districts to benefit themselves and their party. And partisan gerrymandering has a long history, but the majority of voters now demand change. Our votes matter in choosing our state and federal representatives, but when the candidates who represent our views on the issues we care about don't stand a chance because of gerrymandered districts, we lose our critical voices. So let's look at this original gerrymander that gave this practice its name. In 1812, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed the bill with this weirdly shaped district that benefited his party. A newspaper added the claws and the wings. Now in New Hampshire, the maps that we're going to look at, the current maps, were drawn and became official in 2011. They must be redone in 2021 after the census results are in. So this is the New Hampshire House District map. And each of New Hampshire's 400 state reps represent roughly 3,300 people. Small towns may be combined to share one or more reps. Doing that, I admit, is challenging. Do towns have shared interests? How do you determine which towns will be joined together? Next slide, please, Olivia. This is the Senate district map, and there are 24 senators, 24 districts. This map illustrates that disparity between our somewhat urban southern areas and our sparsely settled north. Each of the districts you're looking at has about the same population. And let's look at the next map, which is the Executive Council District. And here's where the fun starts. This map shows our 5 Executive Council districts, each of which includes 1/5 of the state's population. Look at that top district, how geographically huge it is. But now look at District 2 in yellow here, stretching from the west to the east across the entire state. It was created in 2012 by a Republican-dominated legislature. Their intent was to pack as many Democrat-leaning towns into District 2 as possible, with the hopes of winning the other 4 districts from the Republicans. Next slide, please. And these are New Hampshire's congressional districts. So when there's not much you can do to gerrymander 2 districts, but look at this map. It still is weirdly shaped. That little tail up at the top, that's a little sticky out thing, that has all of 64 voters or so up in Hart's location. But clearly it's been drawn in a way that not only reflects population, but does show puts different towns together in ways that may or may not make sense. And this map too will have to be redrawn. Now, what we have from the Carsey School of Public Policy is something that shows growth in population with the red showing loss of population, the blue and dark green showing population increases. And what we can see in the map on the right is that we're going to lose more population in the north, we're going to gain it in the south, and these districts will be further geographically unbalanced, so to speak. Let's have our next slide. Okay, I was expecting a slide about the other congressional districts, and perhaps we don't have this. When we hear about so I'm just going to talk at this point. When we hear about gerrymandering on the national scale, we usually think of the congressional districts. And we had a slide that showed some districts in North Carolina and in Maryland who sued over partisan gerrymandering. One was done by the Republicans, one was done by the Democrats. So either party can do this. In June of 2019, the Supreme Court ruled about those two states and their partisan gerrymandering, and basically said, this political question is beyond the reach of federal courts. They were not going to rule on it. They have ruled on racial gerrymandering, but not on partisan gerrymandering. So the question of what to do comes back to the states, and that's where we are now. So before I turn this over to my colleague, I just want you to think about when all of these New Hampshire districts were drawn in 2011, they were created in secret by 3 members of the legislature. The maps were not available in advance for public comment, and the legislators themselves had only a few days to study the maps before they were expected to vote. And that's not the way voters want our government to work. So we're making the point that an independent redistricting commission whose work is done in public is what we demand. So I'd like to turn this over to Henri for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that background, and thank you so much, Olivia, for setting up this terrific presentation. My name is Henri Clement from the ACLU of New Hampshire. I wanted to thank you all for having me and just say that I'm excited to talk a little bit about efforts in New Hampshire that we have to combat partisan gerrymandering. So the prime bill that we're talking about this session is House Bill 1665, which had just passed the House when the legislature decided not to meet indefinitely and was about to cross over to the Senate. And so we expect when the Senate comes back that this will be one of our top legislative priorities that we'll be pushing on. But so I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what's in the bill. So this bill is sponsored by Representative Marjorie Smith from Durham, who has been introducing bills like this for a pretty long time. And another leader who is a sponsor of this bill is Senator Jeb Bradley, who used to be the Senate Majority Leader and is now, I think, the Deputy Minority Leader, who's a Republican from Wolfboro. And they brought HB 1665 in because they both recognized, I think, what everyone on this Zoom meeting recognizes, which is that when the people who are in charge of drawing the districts are themselves up for election, it creates a real perverse incentive. And so there's a number of different ways that gerrymanders can happen. There are partisan gerrymanders, which is where people try to either crack or pack one political party into a district for partisan gain. That was what the Supreme Court ruled last year it was powerless to address in federal court. There's racial gerrymanders, which is the same sort of idea, except instead of trying to dilute the votes of one political party, you try to dilute the votes of one racial group. And because of the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, it remains the case that the doors of federal court are open for racial gerrymanders. So all is not lost on that front. We also just sort of know historically in many parts of the country that racial gerrymanders and partisan gerrymanders tend to work together. In New Hampshire, which is a pretty racially homogenous state, although of course that's changing, what we've seen has been more historically partisan gerrymanders than racial gerrymanders. And then the third set of gerrymanders is incumbent protection, which is where people just carve up the map in order to make sure that their own seats are safe rather than safe for a political party. So what does House Bill 1665 do? Well, it would establish an independent advisory redistricting commission that would be comprised of 15 members. 5 of those members would be Democrats, 5 of those members would be Republican, and then 5 of those members would either be undeclared or third party. And the way that the commission members are chosen is that the top 2 legislative leaders in each chamber would together generate a list of 10 people in one particular party. So for example, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President would work together for a list of 10 Democrats, and the Senate Minority Leader and the House Minority Leader would together work to draw up a list of 10 Republicans. They would then send those lists across the aisle, and the other side would strike 5 of those 10 people. So the Speaker of the House and the Senate President would get the list of 10 Republicans, and they would choose 5 of them. And then the 5 Democrats and the 5 Republicans that remain would then together choose the remaining 5 members who would be neither Democrats nor Republicans. What else does the bill do? It would require people who apply to be commissioners to disclose whether in the past 10 years they had held elective office, whether they've been a registered lobbyist in the past 10 years in New Hampshire, and which party's ballot they had taken in state primaries or presidential primaries in the past 6 years. So that for the undeclareds, people would get a sense of, do they always vote with the Democrats? Do they always vote with the Republicans? And they'd be able to focus more on true undeclareds rather than just, secret Democrats or secret Republicans. And I should say, the sponsors of this bill worked hand in glove with redistricting experts at the Brennan Center, in particular, Yuri Rudensky, who is probably the most knowledgeable person about redistricting I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. He's a real gift to work with, and he was able to bring to bear a lot of the best practices from other states to make sure that the commission that's being proposed in New Hampshire is up to snuff. So one of the things we know is that the commission size turns out to be pretty important, because if the commission is too small, it can be held hostage by one bad actor. And if it's too large, then it becomes unwieldy. So we think 15 is a good number. You should know that the commission requires a supermajority of 9 votes in order to pass maps. And so that's designed to make sure that there's real compromise and buy-in from everyone, and it's not just like 7, left-aligned folks and 7 right-aligned folks, and then, the middle person, the chair, or whomever cast the deciding vote, and that's that. It's designed to ensure consensus. A couple other great things about this bill. It really promotes transparency by requiring that the commission be subject to the right to know law, so that the public gets to see what the commission is up to and why. It requires that all meetings of the commission are open to the public, that they are noticed in on the commission website or other outlets such as newspapers, and it requires a public meeting before drawing maps and one public meeting after drawing maps in each of New Hampshire's 10 counties. And it shall provide a meaningful opportunity for the public to participate in the meetings. And they'll be held only in spaces that are accessible under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's designed in that way to not only be comprised of non-politicians, but to be very public and transparent about the work that it does. The idea being sunshine is the best disinfectant, and no longer will these maps be drawn with, like, in a smoke-filled background. The bill also sets up a list of criteria for what the commissioners should consider when drawing the maps. So first, the maps are required to comply with the United States Constitution and applicable federal laws, and shall be drawn on the basis of total population. So this preserves the one person, one vote requirement and makes sure that you don't have a district with 40 people and a district with 300. It requires that the districts comply with the New Hampshire Constitution and state laws, and that they be contiguous and not bisected or otherwise divided by districts, and respect the geographic integrity of political boundaries to the extent practicable without violating the requirements of state laws. So, for example, we know that in New Hampshire, the general rule is that a town may not be bisected into multiple districts. There is a provision of the Constitution that allows the voters of a town to petition to split themselves up into multiple districts for state rep, but that hasn't happened yet. Cities can be broken up into wards, but they can't be further broken up. And Senate districts as well have to respect those same boundaries. We also know that in New Hampshire, the county delegation or the state reps from a particular county also serve as the county delegation, which means that House districts really can't cross county lines. And so those requirements are maintained in the bill. The law also says that the plan as a whole shall not have the intent or effect of unduly favoring or disfavoring any political party, incumbent, or candidate for office, which basically just means no partisan gerrymandering. This plan must be politically fair. It also says that districts shall not have the intent or effect of unduly favoring or disfavoring any racial or language group. And the idea is, again, we should make it part of state law that people aren't gerrymandered out of participating in our elections on the basis of race or political party. And then the final criteria is that commissioners should consider the integrity of communities of interest to the extent practicable. So communities of interest are basically the ties that bind us together. And what I like to think about, what is a community of interest is, if you or anyone on this call were to go before the Independent Redistricting Commission and say, I think, I live in Newcastle and I think Newcastle should be put in with Rye because, the towns border each other and they're both beach towns and they share the same middle school. That's a community of interest, right? It's when anyone goes in and says, I think our town should be together for X reason. That's a community of interest. And so what's supposed to happen is the commission is supposed to consider those communities of interest as long as they're not, I want to be in a town that only elects Democrats. The commission is then supposed to draw plans for state representative, state senate, Congress, executive council, and county commissions, and explain basically why it chose the map that it did, and explain how that plan maps up to other plans that were submitted on the basis of things like efficiency gap and compactness. So that's the general idea behind what this commission would do. A couple things it wouldn't do.
Did Henri freeze?
Yeah, I think so.
So Henri, we can't hear you. It seems like you're frozen. Kiri, we're gonna move on to Kiri and then maybe come back to Henri when he unfreezes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Olivia and Henri and Liz. It's kind of like we're getting the band back together here. My name's Kiri Claflin, and I'm with the Kent Street Coalition. And my task is to talk about grassroots organizing. It wasn't clear when we first started to work on grassroots organizing in the winter and spring of 2018, but gerrymandering, as it turned out, was a great subject for galvanizing activists. It started within Kent Street, and then Olivia and I planned and produced, I think we could call it that, the Citizen Action Against Gerrymandering Forum in March of 2018. And we wondered, could we make redistricting sexy? Wow. And I'm going to go ahead and say it. I think, yes, we did. We did it.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. My internet is, we're all trying to work from home. And as it turns out, like maybe the internet is breaking under the strain of that. That was the end of my presentation, though. This bill is going to be great. We really hope that it passes. It would do a lot. Also, the time is now because there's going to be, today is Census Day. Everyone on this call, I expect to go online, 2020census.gov, and fill it out. But today is the Census Day. The census will be completed at the end of the year, and that effort will be led, will be used to reapportion the state starting in 2021. So if we want to make sure that we don't have gerrymandered districts for the next 10 years, this bill needs to pass now. Do the census. Thanks. I'll yield the remainder of my time.
I was just about to talk about the legislation that we had. Henri was talking about the 2020 bill, and this session is a little truncated, so we haven't gotten too far down the road with our organizing this year. But in 2019, we had some bills as well on gerrymandering or on redistricting, HB 706 and SB 8. And so that made it sort of easier. But by that time, since we had had the forum,
your face on here, or my face on here, not that I want you.
Is someone talking?
I'm gonna just mute other participants. Kiri,
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Come up, there's maybe.
Okay. When we finally got bills to organize around, by that time, we had all been educating ourselves over this time because it was a little bit opaque at the beginning, what was gerrymandering and what was redistricting and why did we care and why should we care. And so we had some time to get up to speed on it. So we did. I'm glad you have this picture here of the visibilities. That's a little harder to explain. We put together visibilities quite a lot at the State House, and this is one. It's outside the House election law hearing room. So we would get set up with signs in partisan gerrymandering before or as the representatives or senators were coming into the hearing room. And so that usually had I think a really great effect to show how we felt and how voters and how sort of everyday voters felt about these various bills. A lot of people will also sign in favor of a bill. So that served to make it, to make apparent the support in the community for these redistricting bills. And some of our people also gave testimonies during hearings on the bills. And that was fun. Another thing that activists have been doing and are letters to the editors. This is a great way to communicate with, for one thing, if you put it in the Monitor, if you get it in the Concord Monitor, and they're very friendly, the people at the State House are reading that. They look at it, they see it. But we were able to get letters placed in a lot of communities in the state. So that was great. So I recommend everybody sort of get in the habit of writing letters to the editor, make your thoughts known. We had some postcard campaigns, principally to the legislators. We thanked legislators for voting for the redistricting bills and encouraged them to continue to support redistricting. And we sent more than 1,500 postcards between last year and so far this year. The grassroots folks also did phone banking. And for this project, it was asking constituents to call their representatives and their senators to tell them that they wanted to support redistricting and fair maps. And we didn't want any more gerrymandering. Activists also placed some direct calls to representatives to talk about redistricting and to get a sense of where they were at, particularly a group of Republican representatives who we thought we might be able to persuade to vote in favor of the bills. Last is the most recent thing that has been great, has been the campaign to get warrant articles to be voted on in town meetings. And these were warrant articles, or a warrant article, to told that the town supported to say they wanted redistricting reform, fair maps, and no gerrymandering. And so that's been successful. Obviously, the town meetings have been interrupted, and Amelia Kane was managing that. So that's been a great addition to the toolkit that the grassroots have. And I would say that's about it, unless Olivia can think of more to add.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Lucas to talk about how we win this fight for redistricting reform and how we talk about redistricting.
I always think I know how to unmute myself way more quickly than I know how to unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be on the call, especially on this important issue. And great timing, Olivia, on Census Day. Really just very on message, which is a wonderful segue into some of what I want to talk about, which is how we win. And a big part of our success over the past couple of years, and I know that we faced a governor's veto last session, but I do think there's a lot of successes within this coalition. And it has been centered around a lot of message discipline. And not just within a static message. As we have progressed through the legislative sessions, we've seen some of the nuances within our bill get tweaked or changed, and having this full coalition on message has been a huge asset as we go out and do our advocacy, both direct legislator to legislator, as well as in earned media and paid media efforts. But there are a couple tenets to this campaign that have not changed. And throughout the past 30 minutes, it's been very encouraging because everybody who's spoken has been incredibly on message. And very infrequently in advocacy or whatever work you do you have as much support for an issue as independent redistricting does? This is something that everyone wants across party lines. The polling is through the roof. This is something people want and people expect. So there are a number of key messages that we keep hammering on. One, it's right there in that big red box. Thank you, Olivia. That politicians shouldn't be picking their voters. Voters pick their politician. That is simple. That is common sense to folks. That resonates with people. But you also need to frame the issue, right? And we kind of started this talking about gerrymandering and drawing district lines, rigging the process, smoke-filled back rooms, but also having some evidence of that. Something we've relied on very heavily as a coalition is some of the work done by NHPR. They have done a lot of reporting on gerrymandering being an issue in the state. So you always want to make sure that you're framing the issue, finding the problem being politicians pick their voters, that it's occurring in New Hampshire. We saw a lot of folks lean in very heavily on the Executive Council District 2 that borders Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, Texas, Canada, everything. The giant rainbow across the state, right? Point to specifics that are present in our state, and then start to discuss, all right, so how do we solve this problem? How do we make sure that voters pick their politicians? How do we throw open the doors of redistricting to the public and have their voices heard? Well, we have HB 1665. And as we obviously have changes to the bill as we've gone through the amendment process and through the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights and the Fair Maps project. We are pretty up to date on putting out talking points and explainers as to what is happening with bills. And the importance of that is, we are working with a citizen legislature. We're working with a House of Representatives of 400 and a state Senate that, is 24, but they have a lot of different demands. And whether we like it or not, this has become somewhat of a party line battle to a degree, not entirely though, and that's why you see in a lot of our messaging we emphasize the bipartisan nature, because we do have a lot of Republican champions and Libertarian champions of independent redistricting, and so really leaning in on that has proven to be really important, and something I always emphasize when I'm speaking with legislators of all stripes is this is the best case or the best insurance policy possible for all parties, right? Coming after the census, let's not have any party bosses drawing the maps. Let's just have fair maps. Hence, Fair Maps Coalition. See, we're always trying to stay on message at all times. So as we have progressed through, and as we get back into the legislative session and we transition from our House advocacy into our Senate advocacy, staying up to date with some of those changes that are occurring are super important, because as all of us as advocates are out having conversations, if we are not up to date with what the bill does and what the amendments have been, we don't want to be giving legislators a false impression of what the bill does. And we also want to be able to correct legislators on what the bill has done. As you can see on the slide that Olivia has presented, we have some pivoting in our messaging from last session. Last session, this headline said, HB 706 is a bipartisan bill, yada, yada, yada. There's a new word in there, constitutional. Because as we saw from the 706 debate and the governor's veto message, and when we saw from Republicans, they hung their hat that this is not constitutional. That this is the legislators ceding their responsibility and their constitutional authority to draw the maps. So we've added constitutional, and then a second word, advisory. And you see advisory is in all caps, because we're trying to emphasize that this is a constitutional advisory redistricting commission. And we cannot say that enough times because we have to overcome a governor who has a bully pulpit, who has gotten it into people's minds that this is not an advisory commission, that this is unconstitutional. And that's something that we expect to see him and Scott Walker, who we're sure will come in at some point and start throwing shade at this bill if he hasn't already. So preempting some of those messages preempting it with that advisory language, with that constitutional language. In the amendment of 1665 that passed the House, we put advisory in the title. We put advisory in the bill anytime it mentions the independent commission. So we are learning from the past session, where we still believe that bill was constitutional, but being more deliberate in our messaging moving forward, because that is what will dictate success. Now, we can't, as much as I would like, always convince the governor of a good idea. But what we're doing here is, at least if he is going to veto it, he cannot veto it making a constitutional argument. He's going to have to veto it on an argument of, I just want politicians to draw the map. And that's his position. We do not agree with that. But through our messaging early and frequent and hammering home those points, hopefully we get a legislative session back going again, start having some votes doing the people's business. So when we do get this to his desk, because this will get to his desk, when he writes his veto message, through our outreach to the press, through all the work activists are doing, through letters to the editor, through tweets, through one-on-one conversations, that it's clear that this is constitutional, that this is advisory, that this is about returning power to the people, and the governor's veto of that flies counter to all of those arguments. So I've been really proud of this group. This could have been a very unwieldy project with a lot of different messages flying around at the same time, but this group and all of y'all have done an amazing job of having a really tight, effective message that we've been hammering on for the past, it feels like a lifetime, for the past couple of years, that has put us in a really strong position for whatever's going to happen in the next 6 to 24 months. Who knows yet? But I'll stop there, because I could probably talk for like 30 minutes, and we don't want to do that. So I'll stop there.
Great. And I just want to encourage everyone to take action on redistricting reform. We have seen how citizen activism has changed the course of this debate. And so as we are all home and our senators are all home, we ask you to send a personal letter to your senator, encouraging them to support an independent redistricting fight. Last session, we had all 24 senators who supported this legislation, and we really need to replicate that again and have all 24 senators again support this independent advisory commission. But we've also seen how citizen activism and actions that citizens have taken have really been able to shape this debate. And so my question to those on the phone or listening to it in action: will you take action? And Open Democracy has some tools on our website at opendemocracyaction.org to help make it easier for action to take place. And with that note, I'm going to turn it over for questions. I saw one question come in through the chat, which is directed to Henri. So Henri, if you want to take that chat question away, or if Brian, if you want to unmute and ask it live.
Yeah, I don't see it in the chat, I'm afraid.
You don't see it in the chat. Brian,
yeah, I sent that to you directly to ask Olivia, but I'll ask it since I am unmuted. Henri, this HB 1665 was amended to reinforce to the legislature that you have the last word and you can amend the maps once the commission is done, because that was one of those constitutional concerns that some legislators had. Are you at all concerned that by doing that, if you had partisan actors, that they could undo what the independent commission has done? I've had this question several times now from activists who have heard about the amendment and they've been savvy in saying, hey, well, doesn't that open the door?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So personally, I was of the opinion that the bill was constitutional before. I think the bill from last year was sort of silent on the ability of the legislature to modify the maps once it got them from the commission. And so I think, it was sort of up for interpretation what the legislature's role was. I guess I think the following things. First, I think this commission would be better than no commission. I think that given the veto we had last session, this is the only plausible path forward that has a chance at becoming law. And I think that, legally, the legislature would be free to override the maps drawn by the commission. I think that there would be significant public pressure that would be brought to bear. And that's by design, right? I mean, if you think about the whole point of the legislature is that, the real check on the legislature is that they go up for election every 2 years and they're accountable to the voters for their actions. I expect Open Democracy and the League of Women Voters and Kent Street and a lot of other groups to be out there as they did, in 10-degree weather for years on this bill, at the commission hearings, at the legislature, when people are drawing the maps with signs that say, we support fair maps, we support the maps drawn by the commission. And so I think even if the legislature went ahead and ignored maps that were drawn by the commission, number one, that's what would happen anyways if we didn't have a commission. And number two, at least we'd have the ability to say, that wasn't right, that's not what should have happened, and there'd be a whole, something for the public to rally around. So I think that it would create an ample opportunity for political pressure to be brought to bear rather than legal pressure. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. So the next question I see coming in is the experiences from other successes, states, and failures. And we're going to send that over to Kiri to take a stab and then let others jump in.
This has been a really interesting story over the past number of years because there's been kind of a awakening among grassroots activists, for one thing, that gerrymandering is bad news and that some states were very heavily gerrymandered. I mean, the case of North Carolina is a pretty common one, that they have gerrymandered it so that even if, say, the Democrats got 50% of the votes, they might have 30% of the seats. So, I mean, that's obviously a gerrymander. And the people are rising up and saying, I'm sorry, this is just not going to work out anymore, which has been great. So Wisconsin, they've worked, the grassroots have worked really hard in Wisconsin, and they got it on the ballot, and the voters voted for an independent redistricting commission. And then the Republican-led legislature, I'm being factual, I'm not trying to say this as a partisan thing, but factually, that the Republican-led legislature has been trying to negate that vote, and it's been trying to make it so that they don't have to draw fair maps. But I think generally you see a lot of encouraging. It's encouraging when a lot of these cases get to the courts, and North Carolina is one of the cases that every time the gerrymander comes up into the state courts, and we've heard that federal courts are not getting involved in political gerrymanders, that the judges are saying that this is just obvious, that that this is not what you would call a fair map. So I think on the whole, we should be really encouraged, because voters want this, and voters know about this, and and we're setting examples for other states on how to move toward establishing our fair maps desires into legislation.
Yeah, and to that point, Tom, California, I think, has a gold star on like how they select their commissioners. They have a very robust and transparent process on commission selection, and you've seen the California Commission really be one of those leaders in redistricting reform. I've been really inspired by the Michigan story about how a 26-year-old who started a campaign on Facebook around redistricting that then got hundreds of thousands of petition signatures and got it on the ballot in Michigan. That's part of a movie. Her story is part of a movie, Slay the Dragon, which comes out on Friday. So you can get it on your television on Friday. I think you've seen commissions like New Jersey, where there's only 7 members, not be able to really withhold some political pressure. And that's why the best practice is to have a larger commission than just a small, like the New Jersey commission of 7 people. But I'll let Henri answer if he can speak to some of the other states that have independent redistricting commissions.
Yeah, so, you know, I don't pretend to be an expert on redistricting commissions. So I worked with Henri, who I said is an expert at the Brennan Center. And I think what the best practices that we were trying to incorporate were, number one, getting the right size of a commission. Number two, requiring the supermajority of commissioners to act so that you don't end up sort of with just horse trading. Number three, keeping all of the work done by the commission in public. Number four, listing the criteria that the commission was supposed to consider. I think those are probably the most important things that we've done. And then number five is trying to come up with a way to draw to a fair way to figure out who's on the commission. And probably the trickiest part of coming up with a bill like this is figuring out what the selection process should be for the commissioners. I mean, you can have the legislature do it, you can have the governor do it, you can have, people elect them, you could have, the Secretary of State do it, but we didn't really feel like there was an institution in New Hampshire that was sufficiently free from political influence, which is why we sort of leaned into party leaders pick the people and then cross them off. And that was, we thought, sort of creative enough that everyone could get on board. I will say, there are probably best practices that we don't comply with. Like, for example, like we should be paying these people. But this is New Hampshire, and, that was obviously never going to happen.
Lucas or Liz, do you want to add anything?
Yes.
I'd like to add that Henri is 1,000% an independent redistricting expert. Being honest.
Yeah, I would like to comment. This is not just a project in New Hampshire. The League of Women Voters nationwide has taken this on as its top priority this year. States that already have a redistricting commission are working in some cases to defend it against court challenges. And some of them are working when they're ballot initiative states to get it on the ballot. Here, obviously, we have to work on a legislative fix, but it is across the country. I was at a conference last October with representatives from each of the states working on this issue because the public is demanding this. And none of us know which party will be in power in 2020 in any of the states. So we have to get this fixed now to ensure that fair voting takes place across the country in all districts.
And great, and the League of Women Voters has a great people-powered map, people-powered campaign with folks around the country fighting for redistricting reform. Other questions?
Bob Perry here. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
I was late to this meeting by about 2 minutes, so I may be repeating something that was mentioned earlier in the meeting. I'm going back to the very definition of gerrymandering, and I'm going back to the Black's Law Dictionary definition of it. Black's Law Dictionary is perhaps the gold standard of dictionaries when it comes to legal definitions. And so it says that gerrymandering is dividing a geographical area into electoral districts, often of highly irregular shape, to give one political party an unfair advantage by diluting the opposition's voting strength. So that's the real world consequence of gerrymandering and how it affects voters directly. And I'd like to continue on with an example. Liz mentioned the heavily gerrymandered Executive Council District number 2 here in New Hampshire. Because it is gerrymandered to favor Democrats, it greatly reduces the political influence of Republicans at the ballot box. But it needs to be repeated that this gerrymandered district was created by Republicans in hopes of creating so-called red districts elsewhere. Also, with respect to what Liz said earlier in the meeting about transparency and secrecy, I served on the special committee involving redistricting back in 2011 and 2012. And to give an example of the hijinks that can go on during the redistricting process, we as Democrats were denied the software that was being used by Republicans to create the maps. And I'll note here as well that software that was used in 2011 and 2012 is probably pretty basic when compared to the software that will be available next year to whoever has the ability to use it. And it will be superior even to the red map software that was used. So the degree of software improvement continues with each election cycle, with each redistricting cycle. It's basically down to a science. So given all of that, it demonstrates the importance of creating an independent redistricting commission, in this case 1665, which would be advisory only to the legislature, and as Henri pointed out, would provide an opportunity for the public to comment not only during the process, but if the legislature were to throw out the recommendation of the advisory commission, again, it would give the public an opportunity to try to right the ship.
Liz, do you want to start with a response to the?
Well, I want to emphasize the secrecy again in 2011. And not only were Bob and other members of the committee denied access, they weren't kept informed at all at what was going on, as far as I've been able to find out. There were public hearings that were held at which legislators were expected to present maps, and they had to show up at these public hearings, and I was at 2 of them in 2 different locations with nothing to show the public. The anger was palpable at these, where they said, well, what's the point of this meeting if we can't comment on this? And people at that point were very much concerned with what area towns would be grouped together, because there had been such a bad job done in 2001 of grouping towns in ways that made no sense. We're not going to go into that now. But the feeling among the public in 2011 is, we now have a chance to make this right. So show us the maps. Let's talk about how our town and another town might join together in a district that makes sense versus the way it was done. We can't have a repeat of that in 2021. This has to be done in public with public input. And one part of HB 1665 includes that public input very specifically. There will be a website where the public can get information and offer suggestions as well. And with an independent redistricting commission, I feel confident that those suggestions will be looked at, will be considered. I have no confidence in a legislature, no matter which party is in power, necessarily looking at those public comments. So we need a better way of doing this.
And I think you're absolutely right that technology has improved and people can draw their own maps now. And you've seen other states where people have drawn drawn maps and submitted them to these independent commissions, and those commissions have accepted citizen maps. I love at Tufts University where they're teaching people how to sort of look at maps and draw them and submit ideas. And so you're absolutely right that the technology is there to, draw a district for partisan gain, or say, oh, I don't like this elected official, so I'm going to draw that town out of a district. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to pay particularly careful attention to it, and that's why having an independent redistricting commission is so important. But I'm going to turn it over to Lucas to also respond.
Yeah, no, it's funny. This summer, I'm calling it the after school program, but it's not. It's the ASP program at St. Paul's. What is it? I don't know what it stands for. I should know that.
Advanced studies.
Advanced studies. And that's why I didn't get into ASP. They had a statistics course as part of their program, and one of their final projects was this class made redistrict maps of New Hampshire based on publicly available data. And it was really interesting to see these students really latch onto the idea and draw their own maps. And just looking at them, they were super interesting. There were a lot of different ideas that, having worked in politics for the past decade and coming in right at 2012 when the new maps were presented, I kind of got stuck in a static space of what the maps looked like in the state. And, these students presented their maps and how they drew them and what data they used. And it was interesting at the end of it. I was like, if we pass these bills, y'all can present these to the independent commission. You can be a part of the process. And in talking to Republicans and Democrats in the State House, that is a huge, a really strong argument that we have to get this done, is that public involvement and that transparency and that access. Because at the end of the day, this is about people power. This is the power that we should have. So, it was a nice anecdote from the summer that I thought sort of encapsulated one of the strongest arguments in support of this.
Great. And the next question came in through chat and about what are the polling numbers, Lucas. So you cited those, so I'll hand it back to you.
I would need to find those polling numbers. I've seen them before. They're super real. They do exist. People do really like this, but I don't have this specific poll off the top of my head. But nationally, certainly nationally, you can find polling that redistricting and opposition to gerrymandering is through the roof. New Hampshire specific, it's a little more difficult to find. I think what I'm citing was a poll done separate. It was actually a poll done for a separate issue, but they included redistricting in the issues that they polled on. And this was the top polling issue, which was not great for them, for their issue that they were polling on. But it was good for us to see that redistricting was top of the issues.
Great, and we'll find those polls and include it with a summary. We'll also send you a recording of this webinar or Zoom meeting so that you can share it with others in your community. And I know a few of you joined a little bit late, but you can watch the very beginning of it, as well as action steps. So please stay tuned for all kinds of additional information as this campaign moves forward. And thank you all so much for participating with us today.